this year of the UT Dallas chapter of William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith Groups. It is a pleasure to see you all here tonight. A special welcome to all of you who are coming from off of campus. I want to especially congratulate you on successfully running the gauntlet of parking at this university. It is an extremely difficult feat, so I congratulate you. Tonight's conversation, I think, is especially apropos even for this week. It turns out that Dr. Richard Hawkins, one of the most prominent atheist thinkers of this century, was in Dallas just yesterday evening giving a speech in what is going to be his final speaking tour. That makes me even more appreciative than ever of the fact that we have wonderful individuals who are willing to come into the marketplace of ideas that we find ourselves in, especially to a university that's supposed to epitomize that idea but sometimes fails to, and contend earnestly for the reliability of the Bible, the resurrection of Christ, and the existence of God, all of these things that are necessary for any Christian who wants to advocate for the kingdom of God to believe. And we're very honored to have an excellent exemplar of that with us tonight. Dr. Frank Turek has a DVin from Southern Evangelical Seminary. He has authored several books defending the Christian faith, most notably, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And he instructs this information, keeps it in a publicly available format at crossexamined.org, and is raising up the next generation as well with Cross-Examined Instructor Academy. I'll give it to him right now. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Frank Turek.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is hope for America. Right there. All right, let's go back to September 29th, 2006. That's when Petty Officer Michael Mansour is a United States Navy SEAL operating in Ramadi, Iraq. Mansour is standing on a roof in Ramadi, and he's standing in front of a doorway to this roof. He has two Navy SEAL teammates lying in the sniper-prone position at his feet. They've already taken AK-47 fire and a rocket-propelled grenade, but they're not exactly sure where the enemy is. There's a bit of a lull in the fighting. Insurgents have blocked off the streets in Ramadi, and there's someone on the loudspeaker in the town mosque yelling, "Kill the Americans!" As Mansour and his team are looking for the next attack, an insurgent from an unknown location throws a grenade up on the roof. It hits Mansour in the chest, and it falls to his feet. Due to the length of the throw, there's no opportunity to pick it up and throw it back. He has only a split second to make a decision. He can leap through the doorway behind him and save himself, but if he does, his two teammates lying at his feet will surely die. Mansour yells, "Grenade!" But instead of jumping backward to save himself, he jumps forward, chest first onto the grenade. It detonates. 30 minutes later, 25-year-old Michael Mansour is dead. His two teammates lying at his feet receive only minor injuries because Mansour's body muffled the blast. One of the survivors said at Mansour's funeral, "Mikey looked death in the face that day and said, 'You will not take my friends, I will go in their stead.'" I've never seen a United States president cry until April of 2008. That's when President George W. Bush invited Mansour's parents into the East Room of the White House to give them their son's Medal of Honor posthumously. The president couldn't even get through the citation without breaking down. Since then, Mansour's high school in Garden Grove, California, built a new stadium. They named it Michael A. Mansour Memorial Stadium. The golden trident insignia that the SEALs wear dominates the 50-yard line. January 2019, North Island, California, just outside of San Diego, the United States Navy commissioned the USS Michael Mansour, the newest guided missile destroyer in the fleet, Zumwalt class. I was in San Diego about a year ago, and this ship was sitting there in the harbor. They've only built 3 of them. This is Mansour's mother, Sally, being escorted onto the ship, named in honor of her fallen son. Now, why did they do this? Because Michael Monsoor literally sacrificed himself to save his friends. There's no greater love than to sacrifice yourself to save your friends, said Jesus of Nazareth before he went to the cross. Michael Monsoor sacrificed himself to save his friends. The question is, would anyone sacrifice himself to save you? And the answer is, someone already has. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. But in today's culture, a lot of people don't think the story's true. After all, they think it's invented. It was written down by religious people. We know religious people tend to embellish things. It's also got miracles in it. And at a school that's heavy in engineering like UT Dallas, you might not believe in miracles. How can you believe in miracles? In fact, how many people in this room have seen someone rise from the dead after you knew they were dead for at least 36 hours? Yeah, none of us. Why? Because it doesn't happen. Yet if you're a Christian, you have to believe something none of us have ever seen. How rational is that? Well, I actually think it's quite easy to show that Christianity is true. You only need to answer 4 questions. In other words, if you investigate these 4 questions honestly, I think you'll realize that the answer to these 4 questions is yes. And if the answer to these 4 questions is yes, then Christianity is true. Not just true for me, but true for everyone. What are the 4 questions? Here are the 4 questions. Now that is some pretty groovin' music, isn't it? Yeah. That's actually from our TV show, which is on every Wednesday nights on DirecTV channel 378. If you don't have DirecTV, it's on Roku. Just look for NRB TV on Roku, National Religious Broadcasters. If you don't have DirecTV and you don't have Roku, it's on this new technology sweeping Dallas right now. It's called the internet. Have you guys heard of this? Yeah, it's live streamed on our website, crossexamined.org. We're also on radio every Saturday mornings. In fact, there's a network called American Family Radio, AFR. It's here in Dallas. It's below 92 FM. I don't know what the exact, anyone know what the exact number it is? 98.5. 98.5. Not 9, can't be. 90.5? All right, 90.5. But actually, it doesn't really matter because it's podcasted. So you can listen to it whenever you want. It's called the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. We actually do 2 a week. So you can check that out. Now, why are these the 4 questions? Truth, God, miracles, and the New Testament. And this is going to serve as our outline here tonight. First question, does truth exist? Why is that important? Because you often hear people saying there's no truth, or they're saying, you know, it's just true for you but not for me, or all truth is relative. You've heard these claims. It's postmodernism, it's relativism. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if there is no truth, Christianity can't be true. Of course, if there is no truth, atheism can't be true either. Right? Well, look, if there was no truth, ladies and gentlemen, would you spend thousands of dollars coming to college? I mean, like, why are you here, right? You're here to learn truth, right? Would you ever read a book if there was no truth? Would you ever be able to catch someone in a lie if there was no truth? No, lies presuppose truth. So we're going to deal with that question first. Second question, does God exist? Obviously, Christianity can't be true if there's no God, but I hope to show you tonight that there really is a God. We're going to mention 3 arguments for the existence of God. These arguments are taught in the Bible, but you don't need the Bible to know them. In fact, you can establish that God exists without any reference to any religious writings. I mean, did people know there was a God before there was a Bible? Yeah, of course, okay. Third question, are miracles possible? Christianity can't be true if miracles are not possible. And I just asked you if anyone's seen a miracle. Nobody said yes, a resurrection anyway. But I hope to show you in point 3 that not only are miracles possible, but the greatest miracle in the Bible, even atheists are admitting the evidence for. We'll see that tonight. Then we're going to get to the key question, is the New Testament true? The New Testament doesn't have a prayer if there's no truth, no God, or no miracles. But if truth exists, if God exists, if miracles are possible, then we can see if the documents that were written down about 2,000 years ago are reliable enough for us to conclude that one event from the ancient world took place. If this event occurred, Christianity's true. If this event didn't occur, it's false. What's the event? The resurrection, right? If Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity's true. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, game over, it's false. You might as well sleep in on Sunday and do what you want the rest of the week, because if Jesus hasn't risen from the dead, if you're a Christian, your faith is in vain, as the Apostle Paul himself said in his first letter to the church at Corinth. He said, Christianity's false if Jesus hasn't risen from the dead. Your faith's in vain. Do you realize that Christianity is a religious worldview that you can investigate and discover whether or not it's true? It's not just someone's philosophy. You can see if this really happened. And if you can see the resurrection actually happened, then you can show that the entire Bible is the Word of God. We won't have time to go that whole route today, but it's in the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Now, what we're going to do right here is start here at point 1. Does truth exist? Are you guys ready to go? Come on, all right, let's go. All right, now whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson. Right? Because Tom Cruise had him on the witness stand and he said to him, Colonel, I want the truth. And Nicholson said, you can't handle the truth. One guy had it right. The rest of you can't handle the truth. He didn't say it that way. If he said it that way, the movie would have gone nowhere. All right, here's how he said it.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
All right, let's try that again. I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Now that felt better, didn't it? Didn't you always want to do that here, at college or in the, at church? You can't handle the truth. Well, there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth. They're saying, you got your truth, I got my truth, all truth is relative, it's true for you but not for me, all these claims. Well, if you don't get anything else out of what we talk about tonight, what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes, I think is the most important thinking skill I've ever learned. And even if you're an atheist, this will be helpful. To show you what a dimwit I was 33 years old, I already had a master's degree, and I did not know what I'm about to tell you right now. And you know why I didn't know it? Because I never had a course in logic. How many here have had a real course in logic? Can I see your hands, please? All right, you see these people with their hands up? These are the homeschoolers. Here they are, right here. Okay. We don't teach logic in public school anymore. We should. If we did, the public schools would be a lot better. Instead of teaching kids how to think, we're teaching them what to feel. And that can be dangerous. Why? Because if you follow your feelings without reason or without moral restraint, you're going to wind up in a very dark place, and it's going to hurt you and many others. Yes, emotion makes life fun, but logic makes life safe. In fact, we're teaching a course next week online called Train Your Brain. It's for 6th to 8th graders, but we also have a segment for everybody else. Because most people haven't had a course in logic. And once you get a course in logic, you can start seeing through all the fallacies you hear about in our culture. Like this one. Suppose someone were to say to you, there is no truth. You should ask that person a question. What should the question be? Yes. When someone says there's no truth, you want to say, is that true? Can everyone see that this is a self-defeating statement? That this statement doesn't meet its own standard. To say there is no truth, it would be like me saying I can't speak a word in English. If I were to say that, what would you say? Man, you just used English to say it. Now, here's the thinking skill you've got to get good at using. What you want to do when somebody says something is pause and then turn the claim on itself. Turn the claim on itself. In other words, when somebody says there is no truth, you want to turn the claim on itself and see if that very claim meets its own standard. And simply ask, is that true? Now, you can wow your friends with this, and you can be very kind doing it. Why? Because you're not making statements, you're asking questions, right? So what we're going to do is ask questions. Every one of the responses we're about to go through is a question that you can ask somebody if they say something like this. In fact, sometimes this there is no truth claim is said this way. There's no such thing as absolute truth. If someone were to say there's no such thing as absolute truth, if you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? Yeah, is that an absolute truth claim? Or you might want to say, are you absolutely sure? Because this is an absolute truth claim, claiming there are no such thing as absolute truth claims. There's no such thing as absolute truth. It defeats itself. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Now, in our culture today, it's more said this way. There isn't the truth, only my truth. In other words, you have your truth, I have my truth, you live your truth, I'll live my truth, we'll all get along. This sounds so right, doesn't it? It sounds like we all ought to believe this. It sounds so Oprah, doesn't it? There's just one big problem with it. It's logically self-defeating. Because if someone were to say this, if you turn the claim on itself, what question would you ask back? Yeah, someone said it up here. Is that just your truth or the truth? So if someone says there isn't the truth, only my truth, you say, is that just your truth or the truth? In other words, is the statement on the top just your truth? In other words, is it just your opinion? If it is, okay, but why should I believe it? But if you're saying the statement on the top is the truth, can everyone see that the first half of the statement says there aren't any the truths? Can everybody see that this is a the truth statement, claiming there are no such thing as the truth statements? It defeats itself. I know it's very unpopular to say this, but I've got to say it anyway. There's no such thing as your truth. There's no such thing as my truth. There's just the truth. In fact, if someone says, I have my own truth, you might want to ask him, do you have your own math too? I mean, imagine if Kenneth here, the nice gentleman that kicked this whole thing off, said to me, hey, Frank, we need some help here around UT Dallas tomorrow. Can you hang out and spend an extra day here? We got some stuff we need to clean up at the Reasonable Faith Club and everything. In fact, if you stay, I'll pay you $10 an hour. You just tell me how many hours you work. At the end of the day, I'll pay you. Now, actually, Kenneth would never do this. He doesn't pay that much. All right. But let's suppose I did. I stayed and worked on to dusk tomorrow, and I'm done. He says, okay, Frank, what do I owe you? I said, okay, well, I worked 15 hours. So 15 hours times $10 an hour, you owe me $150,000. He's going to say, $150,000? No, I owe you $150,000. And I go, oh, no, you don't understand. I have my own math. Right? He's going to say, you're crazy. There's not my math or your math. Now, parents, I'm not talking about the kind of math your kid brings home and you go, this isn't my math. No, I'm not talking about that, right? There's not my math or your math. There's just math. There's one answer to the problem, not my answer or your answer. There's just the answer. And the same thing is true about truth. If we start believing we can live our own truth, eventually we're going to smack up against reality and it's going to hurt. Now, sometimes it's said this way, actually. It's true for you, but not for me. Well, Christianity may be true for you, but Buddhism's true for me. If somebody says that, what question might you ask them?
Is that true for everybody?
Yes, yes. Jack has it down here. Jack has seen this before. It's a little bit more subtle, but if somebody says it's true for you, but not for me, you simply want to ask, is that true for everybody? Is true for you, but not for me, true for everybody? Because it's true for you, but not for me, is true for everybody. Then true for you, but not for me can't be true because it's true for everybody. Did I say that right? I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough. But that's because it's self-defeating. Again, it's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Actually, there's a more fun way of dealing with this. If somebody says it's true for you, but not for me, try that the next time you get pulled over. Right? Like, let's say you're out here on the George W. Bush Highway and you're going like 100 miles an hour. Cop sees you, pulls you over, walks up to the car, knocks on the window, you put the glass down, he says, you were going 100. It's easy to get out of a ticket. You simply say, ha, that's true for you, but not for me. And you speed away. He can't give you a ticket if it's not true for you. No, if it's true you were going 100, that's true for all people at all times, in all places, when referring to you at that time. It's just true. You know, I go to a lot of churches. I normally ask people, do you think Christianity is true? And most people will say yes. And then I'll ask them, well, why do you think it's true? You know what answer I get more than any other? Because I have faith. Is that a good answer? Does your faith change whether or not God exists or Jesus rose from the dead or the Bible's telling the truth? No, your faith doesn't change a thing about those things. I mean, do you have to believe something to make it true? Do you have to believe in gravity to stay on the ground? Do people who don't believe in gravity float away? Hey, look, there's another one. Hey, if you believe, you'll come back. No, that's not the way it works. You say, well, why is the Bible always talking about faith then? Well, it's important to understand there's two kinds of faith. There's belief that, and then there's belief in. Belief that is getting evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Bible writers are telling us the truth. That's what we call apologetics. It doesn't mean we're saying we're sorry. It means we're giving evidence for what we believe. But all the belief that in the world won't get your moral transgressions forgiven. For that, you got to go from belief that to belief in. There's a difference. Belief that is just of the head. Belief in is not only of the head, it's of the heart. You can know something's true and not assent to it. Right? In fact, we know this in relationships. When I first met my wife almost 40 years ago, I got evidence that she would be a good wife, but all the evidence in the world didn't make her my wife. I had to take a step of trust in her to ask her to be my wife. And in a momentary lapse of judgment, she said yes. That's the difference between belief that and belief in. Faith does not mean you have no evidence. Faith in the Bible means trusting in what you have good evidence to believe that is true. Trusting in what you have good evidence to believe that is true. And by the way, the Apostle John sums all this up in one verse at the end of chapter 20 of his biography we call a gospel. I'm paraphrasing it, but he says this: these things were written down so you may know that Jesus is the Savior, and by believing in him you may have life in his name. You see, belief that and belief in one sentence. That's the difference. So you can have all the evidence in the world. If you don't want to believe in, that's fine. God's not going to force you into heaven against your will. If you don't want him, he'll separate himself from you, and that's what hell ultimately is. Speaking of hell, this is a judgment call from hell. You ought not judge. How many times have you heard people say that? Now, when somebody says this, you just want to turn the claim on itself and ask a question. If somebody says you ought not judge, what question are you going to ask? Hey, is that a judgment? Or you might want to say, if we're not to judge, then why are you judging me for judging? You notice they're doing the same thing they're claiming you ought not do? Well, Frank, didn't Jesus say don't judge? Nope, never said it. Oh, sure he did. He said it in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. All right, I know it's going to sound weird for just a minute, but it's true. Stick with me. There are no verses in the Bible. There are no verses in the Bible. Do you think when Matthew was writing his gospel that we call a gospel, it's really a biography, that he said, here's chapter 7, verse 1? No, when were the chapter and verse divisions put in? About 500 years ago to help us navigate the text, which is really important, right? I mean, because if you didn't have numbers, it'd be really hard to find your way around. I mean, imagine in one Sunday morning, you didn't have numbers in your Bible, and your pastor didn't have numbers in his, and he just got up there at the podium with this big Bible, and he opened it up, and he looked at you, and he said, let's go about 2/3 of the way in. Let's see if we can find the same spot. No, you couldn't do that, right? You need numbers to find your way around. The problem is, we think if it's got a number in front of it, we can take it out and make it say whatever we want out of context. You can't do that. In fact, well, some of you are going to hate me for saying this, but I don't care. I'm leaving tomorrow, okay? This is why you should never say Jeremiah 29:11 is some sort of promise to you. What's Jeremiah? You know Jeremiah 29:11. Oh, the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, plans to give you hope in the future. I mean, this is on pillows. This is on birthday cards. This is on coffee mugs. It's on posters. It's everywhere. Is this a promise to 21st century Christians? No, what's the context of the passage? This is actually a promise to the exiles who were forcibly taken out of Judah in 586 BC by the Babylonian dictator Nebuchadnezzar. God judged them. One reason he judged them, by the way, is they were sacrificing their children to Molech. We just sacrifice our children to ourselves here in this country. And they were taken to Babylon, and God, through the prophet Jeremiah, told those people that 70 years later he was going to prosper them and bring them back into the land. And actually it happened. In 516 BC, they started to rebuild the temple. They went back to where they came from. 70 years later, he prospered them. But this is not a promise to 21st century Christians. When a Christian tells me, I'm claiming Jeremiah 29:11 to myself, I said, why don't you claim Jeremiah 44:11 for yourself? What's Jeremiah 44:11? Jeremiah 44:11 is the promise that God made to the exiles who tried to escape to Egypt during the attack of Nebuchadnezzar, and God told them, don't go to Egypt. You know what Jeremiah 44:11 says? It says, I will destroy you and all Judah. You don't see that stitched into a pillow. You don't see that on a birthday card, happy birthday. I will destroy you and all Judah. That is so sweet, Grandma. Thank you so much. No, we're taking stuff out of context. You can't do that. The Bible's not a book of fortunes. You just pick verses out. And the same thing is true, by the way, in Matthew 7, verse 1. Does Jesus just say, judge not, and he stops right there? No, what does he say? He says, judge not, lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, you hypocrite. Notice that's a judgment right there, you hypocrite. Take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. Is Jesus telling us not to judge here? No, he's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying, get that problem out of your life first before you try and help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge. It's actually a command on how to judge. In other words, don't judge hypocritically. If you've got that problem, fix it, then go help your brother. But it would be completely ridiculous to say don't make judgments. Why? Number one, it's a judgment itself. Number two, you'd be dead already if you didn't make judgments. You made 100 judgments today just getting over here. And now you're going, this was a bad judgment. This guy's crazy. What? Everybody makes judgments. Richard Hawkins here last night's making judgments. There's no God. The Bible's not telling the truth. There is no objective purpose or meaning to life. When you die, you're just going to become worm food. It's hopeless. Have a nice day. These are all judgments. The question isn't whether or not you can make judgments. The question is, are your judgments true? I will say this, though. Jesus did save a very stern rebuke for people who were judgmental. And who were the judgmental ones in his day? The Pharisees. And who were the Pharisees? What was their job? Well, some of them were on the Sanhedrin. That's the Jewish ruling council to whom Rome delegated much of the day-to-day lawmaking authority. In other words, the Pharisees were the politicians. And Jesus went after these people. Are you telling me Jesus got involved in politics? Yes! And he wasn't so nice doing it. In fact, if you think Jesus was a sweet guy who's never said a bad word about anyone, you have not read John chapter 2, John chapter 8, or Matthew chapter 23. What happens in John chapter 2? Jesus makes a whip and he goes and he jacks people up in the temple. Sweet and gentle Jesus did this? Yes! And then in John chapter 8, he's arguing with these politicians, these Pharisees. And he's right in the middle of the argument when he says, your father is the devil. Jesus, you can't say that. That's not very Christ-like. Excuse me, I am Christ. You imagine you're having an argument with somebody and you stop right in the middle and you go, your father is the devil. Never try that with a sibling, by the way. And then in Matthew 23, Jesus really goes after these people. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. He says, you're tithing your spices, but you're neglecting the more important matters of the law. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the former without neglecting the latter. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. What? Jesus said this? Yes, Jesus was not Barney. Can't we all get along, boys and girls? No! I came to bring a sword. It's going to divide mother and daughter, father and son. How often do you ever hear those passages talked about? But many of you in this room know those passages are true because some of you are divided in your own family over Jesus. And guess what? You ought to be. Jesus did not come to bring unity with the world. He came to bring unity in the church. You're supposed to follow Jesus if you're a Christian. And if you're not a Christian, you're supposed to follow Jesus. Despite what the world says. By the way, notice he said, you're neglecting the more important matters of the law. He's scolding politicians. You know, we're doing the same thing here. We're telling people what light bulbs they can and can't use, but we won't say don't murder your children. We're telling people what straws they can and can't use, but we won't tell them don't mutilate your children. We're neglecting the more important matters of the law right here. So when you vote, make sure you vote the more important matters of the law. I'm sure you can find things in both parties you like, but look at the most important matters of the law. What's the most important? The right to life is the right to all of the rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. So Jesus was tough. He wasn't a wimp like we think he was. In fact, why did they kill him? You know why they killed him? Because he claimed to be God. That was blasphemy to the Jews and sedition to the Romans, and he annoyed a lot of powerful people like Caiaphas, the high priest who sentenced him to die. I think Caiaphas knew Jesus was the Messiah. Why? Because right after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, what does Caiaphas say? It's better that one innocent man die than the whole nation perish. Caiaphas didn't want to lose his job, so he had Jesus killed. He didn't like it. He knew, I think, that Jesus was the Messiah. But he didn't like the truth. In fact, as Augustine said, we love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. For you military people in here, by the way, I was in the Navy for 8 years, which stands for never again volunteer yourself. For you military people in here, you always get more flack when you're over the target. If you tell somebody the truth and they're shooting back at you, you're over the target. They don't want their evil deeds exposed. Men love darkness rather than light. So don't buy into this idea that you can't make judgments. You have to make judgments. It's unavoidable. Everybody's making judgments. You have to make judgments without being judgmental. And there's nobody in this room, nobody watching online, who is going to get to God by being better than other people, because we don't get to God by being better than other people. We get to God because what Jesus did for us. You see, evangelism is just one beggar showing another beggar where the food is. So we have to make judgments without being judgmental. Now, we could go through many more self-defeating statements. We don't have time. I just want to sum it up all this way. Can everybody see that this statement right here shoots itself? Which is big for a Texas audience right here, right? Okay. Which means relativism and postmodernism are false because they claim it's true that there is no truth. Why would you ever come to a university to have some professor tell you the truth that there is no truth? How does that make any sense? And as you know, we go to a lot of universities. On Monday night, Lord willing, we'll be at Arizona State. Here's an event we did at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and they love the Bible there about as much as the University of California at Berkeley does. And when somebody gets up to the microphone, that microphone right there will serve our purposes for tonight. I normally ask somebody who's not a Christian a question. And I want to tell you now that I might ask you this question so you have a minute to think about it, because it's not fair for me to spring a question on you. So I'm going to tell you right now what question I might ask you. This is a question I ask a lot of people. The question is this: if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? I've had atheists stand at that microphone in front of hundreds of people and say, no! No. I thought you claimed to be reasonable. I thought you claimed to be rational. How is it that you wouldn't believe something that was really true? Well, it's not reasonable. It's not a head problem. It's a heart problem. They don't want it to be true. They don't want there to be a God. Why? Because they want to be God over their own lives. They're not on a truth quest. They're on a happiness quest. And they're just going to believe whatever they think is going to make them happy. Here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. You can make yourself happy over the short term doing a lot of fun, but selfish and ultimately destructive things. Yet over the long term, it's a disaster. And everyone in this room over 40 knows what I'm talking about because many of us have tried it ourselves, right? I'm going to live it for me. I'm going to live it my way the whole time. No, you're not. Not very long. Who's going to put up with that? It's all about you all the time. If you live completely for yourself, it's all about you, chances are you're going to wind up divorced, addicted, broken, alone, and probably prematurely dead. If you want contentment, you've got to go straight through truth, and Jesus is the truth. So truth does exist. It's self-defeating to say it doesn't. So now we want to dive into the question, is it true that God exists? And I mentioned 3 arguments for the existence of God. I'm going to mention them. We don't have time to go through all of them. But I'll spend a little bit of time on the first one. The first argument for the existence of God is from the beginning of the universe, known as the cosmological argument. Cosmological comes from the Greek word cosmos, which means world or universe, and it says if the universe had a beginning, then it must have had a beginner. The second argument is the argument from design, known as the teleological argument. Telos is a Greek word meaning design or purpose, and it says if there's design in the universe and design in you, life, then there must be a designer. Now, these 2 arguments have some scientific evidence behind them. We can only mention it here tonight. The third argument doesn't have any science behind it. It's more philosophical in nature, yet it's the argument you've intuitively understood since you were a very small child. It's the argument from morality known as the moral argument. And it says that there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one. Like it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Or it's wrong to murder 6 million people in a Holocaust. Or it's wrong to shoot school children. That's what happened yesterday in Georgia. And there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no standard beyond humanity, everything's just a matter of opinion. It's just your opinion against a baby torture opinion. It's your opinion against Hitler's opinion. It's your opinion against some school shooter's opinion. We know these things aren't just a matter of opinion. We know it's really wrong to do those things. If that's the case, there must be a standard of really right, a standard of righteousness outside of ourselves that we're obligated to obey. If that standard doesn't exist, there is no objective morality. But we know certain things are right and other things are wrong, so that standard must exist, and that standard is what we mean by God. By the way, I don't know if you've noticed, but in our country, we seem to be inventing rights every 10 minutes. Do you know there are no rights unless God exists? There's not only no right to abortion, there's no right to life if there's no God. There's not only no right to same-sex marriage, there's no right to natural marriage. There's no trans rights, there's no human rights, there's no Christian rights. There are no rights, period, unless God exists. The problem is many of the people putting forth these new rights have no standard outside of themselves to actually show that they're rights. They're just preferences. Now, I wish we had more time to go through that. We don't. We've got to go back to the cosmological argument. Now, you got to admit it was worth coming here tonight just to see God do that. Come on. Some of you said, I've never seen God move. Oh, really? Check this out. Now, this is the argument that many say points back to the... Now, I know there's some Christians in here going, Frank, you know, we're Christians in here, and we don't believe in the Big Bang. You guys don't believe in the Big Bang? I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. In fact, the evidence for the Big Bang is so good that even atheistic scientists are admitting it. Probably the top physicist in the world until he died about 6 years ago was Stephen Hawking. And Hawking said this. He said, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Now, despite being an atheist, Hawking's admitting space-time and matter had a beginning out of nothing. Now, you know what his explanation was? In the last book he wrote, called The Grand Design in 2010, he said this, and this is a quote from page 180. He said, because there's a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Hello, McFly. What? To which John Lennox, the brilliant Oxford mathematician and philosopher, said, when brilliant scientists say nonsense, it's still nonsense. Gravity didn't even exist, and how can gravity create a universe? They have no answer. And it's not just Hawking who said this. An agnostic astronomer who now teaches at Tufts University, a cosmologist by the name of Alexander Vilenkin, put it this way. He said, with the proof now in place, cosmologists, by the way, a cosmologist is not someone that puts on your makeup, all right? Cosmologist studies the universe. Cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, two interesting words in what Vilenkin's saying here. First is the word proof. Do you know that science is by definition tentative? There's always new information that can come in and overturn existing theories. I know you can't trust everything from Wikipedia, but if you look up in Wikipedia, you'll see a page that talks about all the overturned theories, scientific theories in history, and there's scores of them because new information comes in, right? It's rare to use the word proof, but Vilenkin sees so much evidence crossing at one conclusion that he's saying, I'm calling it a proof. The other interesting word is the word problem. Why is it a problem if there's a cosmic beginning? Because if space-time and matter had a beginning out of nothing, whatever created space-time and matter can't be made of space-time and matter. In other words, there must be a cause beyond nature, because nature itself is the effect, so it can't be the cause. Now, Vilenkin is a believer in the multiverse. Have you heard of the multiverse? That there may be other universes out there, and ours just looks designed, even though it really isn't. But even Vilenkin admits that the whole show, if there are other universes out there, all of them together had an absolute beginning. Now, we're not going to go through the evidence for this. Why? Number one, we don't have time. Number two, it's all in the book, chapter 3. And number three, it's not controversial. Even atheists are admitting it. What is controversial is what caused the universe to have a beginning. Now, before we get there, I want to show you one piece of evidence from philosophy, which I think is airtight, that shows that the universe had a beginning. And this is sometimes called the Kalam cosmological argument. Let's look at this timeline for a second. Here's today. There's yesterday. There's the day before yesterday. There's last week. Let's say we don't know how far back this timeline goes. Here's my question. Can this timeline be infinite into the past? No, why not? Why can't it be infinite into the past? Yeah, because if it were infinite into the past, this day right here would never get here. Because you'd always have to live another day before you got to today. Why? Because there's an infinite number of days before today. You guys are looking at me like you have intellectual constipation right now. This is hard to get your mind around, but if there were an infinite number of days before today, this day never would have gotten here. But since today has arrived, there can only be a finite or limited number of days before today, which means time at some point had a beginning. If time had a beginning, what could have caused time? Only something outside of time. Whatever caused time is timeless. So what caused the timeless, uncaused cause? Nobody. That's the whole point. If you're outside of time, you don't have a beginning, which means you don't have a cause, and if you don't have a cause, you're uncaused. So the who made God question doesn't work. So the bottom line is this. If the past were infinite, today never would have arrived, but today is here. So there can only be a finite number of days before today, which means the universe itself had a beginning, including time. So let's just jump to the bottom line. And here's the bottom line. The evidence leaves us with one of the following two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, which is the atheistic view, or someone created something out of nothing, which is the theistic view. Now, which view is more reasonable? No one created something out of nothing, or someone created something out of nothing? What do you think? Someone. I was at Texas A&M. Aggie mating call. I was at Texas A&M. It had to be 15 years ago. I put this slide up, and one atheist said, oh, I think number one is more reasonable. I said, number one? Let's look at number two for a second. Number two says someone created something out of nothing. Now, that's a miracle, right? But at least you got a miracle worker. You got someone. Number one is a miracle with no miracle worker. That's clearly absurd. In fact, I said to the audience at A&M that night, I said, to show you how seriously we all take the law of causality. And by the way, The law of causality doesn't say everything has a cause. The law of causality says everything that comes to be has a cause. I said to show you how seriously we all take the law of causality, that everything that comes to be has a cause. There is nobody sitting here in this auditorium tonight who is currently worried that a hippopotamus has appeared out of nothing by nothing in your dorm room and is currently pooping on your pillow. Right? You don't think that can happen, right? Because you know that everything that comes to be has a cause. And if atheists are going to say the whole universe can come into existence without a cause, why doesn't everything come into existence without a cause? Why don't Teslas pop into being without a cause? You wake up one morning, you look outside, you see your Hyundai is a Tesla. And you go, how do I charge this thing, right? Why don't MacBook Pros pop into existence out of nothing, by nothing, without a cause? Could have saved me $3,000 if they would. If you're hungry after this seminar tonight and you want to have a pizza, does it make sense to order one, or should you just sit in your kitchen, wait, and hope one pops into existence out of nothing, by nothing, without a cause? No, it seems to me the atheists have all the faith, all the blind faith. In fact, here's a question to ask an atheist. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? That was a question the philosopher Leibniz posed a couple hundred years ago. Why does anything exist if there is no God? Now, ladies and gentlemen, what could have caused this? If space, time, and matter literally had a beginning, and this is the standard view now in physics, the standard view in cosmology, the standard view in philosophy, the standard view in the Bible, that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing, what could have created that? Only something outside of space, time, and matter. In other words, the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create. Why? Because to go from a state of nothingness to a state of creation, someone had to make a choice, and only persons can make choices. Impersonal forces don't make choices. The cause would also have to be intelligent, to have a mind to make a choice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? God. You say, how do you know it's the Christian God, Frank? We don't. Yet. I mean, this could be Allah or some other theistic or deistic God. There's no scientific argument that gets you all the way to Jesus. This could be the Christian God. It has the attributes of the Christian God. And if we keep going through the evidence and we discover that Jesus really did predict and accomplish his own resurrection from the dead, then we can say the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,991 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. We haven't gotten there yet, but it could be the God of the Bible. You with me so far? All right. Now, the next argument, the teleological argument, is so spectacular, but we don't have time to cover it tonight. I want to spend more time on the New Testament. In fact, one of the leaders here at the Reasonable Faith chapter here is Alan Hainline. Alan, raise your hand right there. He's an expert in this argument, the fine-tuning argument of the universe. So you want to join this club to learn more about that. There's also the design in life, and we briefly mentioned the moral argument. But we got to move on to are miracles possible? But before we do, if we had time to go through all these arguments, we would discover that there's a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, moral creator who created and sustains all things. This is the God of biblical Christianity, and we haven't even opened the Bible yet. In other words, this is called natural theology, ladies and gentlemen. God has written 2 books. He's written, yes, through human beings, the Bible, but he's also written a book we call his works. The Bible is his word. The other book he's written are his works, creation, conscience. And just by creation and conscience and design that you can see in creation, you can get these attributes. In fact, if someone were to ever ask you, how do you know that God exists? Here's what I say. I know God exists by his effects. If there's a creation, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause, a creator, a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent creator. If there's design in the universe and design in life, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause, a designer. If there's a moral law written on the heart, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a moral lawgiver. That's the cause. If there's evidence that a man predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause. There has to be somebody like God who could predict and accomplish the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. You're always reasoning from effect to cause, even if you think you have some sort of personal experience with God. Answered prayer, or God, you think God spoke to you, you're doing the same thing. You're saying the answered prayer or the communication is the effect, and you're reasoning back to the cause, God. This is what scientists do, ladies and gentlemen. They reason from effect back to cause. The problem with atheism is that they have no cause. There's no cause for any of this. Even the natural laws that they say run everything, where do laws come from? They come from lawgivers. But we got to move on now to point 3, are miracles possible? Let's go back 500 years ago before there was any kind of mass communication. If one particular king, say, wanted to communicate with another king over a great distance, how could he do it? What would he send? He would send a message, right? And what would be on that message? A seal. That seal would be on the message and authenticate that the message came from the king. Now, it seems to me that that seal would have to have a couple of characteristics. Number one, it would have to be unique to the king, because if everyone had it, you wouldn't know if the message really came from the king, right? And number two, it would have to be difficult to forge, because if you could forge that seal, again, you can send false messages from the king. So when we look at why are there miracles, or what is the purpose of miracles, miracles, particularly in the Bible, are like a seal from the ultimate king. It authenticates that this person speaks for God. That's what miracles are for. In fact, in the Bible, we could say this: the miracle confirms the message, the sign confirms the sermon. And if you look at the Bible, let's just look at the Bible from, say, Abraham to Jesus. That's approximately 2,000 years, right? How many miracles do you think are in the Bible from, say, Abraham to Jesus? Ballpark, what would you say? This is the interactive portion of the program. What would you say? 100? 200? You guys are sounding like Charlie Brown's teacher right now. Wah, wah. There's about 250, okay? Now take those 250 and spread them out over 2,000 years. How often do you get a miracle? How often? Math majors? Homeschoolers, help us out. What's the number? 8. There's a homeschooler in the back. Yes. You get 1 miracle every 8 years. Does that sound like a lot of miracles? We think miracles are happening in the Bible all the time. They're not. 1 miracle every 8 years? But do they happen that way? Do you get a miracle and 8 years later you get another one, 8 years? No. When God is doing miracles, particularly through people, sometimes he does them directly, obviously, but when he does them through people, you'll notice that miracles are done in 3 time periods: Moses, Elijah and Elijah, and Jesus and the apostles. Why? Because these people have new revelation that needs new confirmation. There's a new sermon that needs a new sign. There's a new message that needs a new miracle. Why should you believe in Moses? Because Moses can do miracles. Why should you care what Elijah and Elijah or Jesus says? Because they can do miracles. That's the purpose of miracles in the Bible. They're not done for entertainment. They're there to show people that this person speaks for God. Now, here's the problem. A lot of people think miracles are impossible. For example, Noah and the ark. For you Christians in here, can we just keep this between ourselves? But can we all agree that Noah and the ark is crazy? Thank you. A resurrection. I already asked you, has anyone seen one? Nobody said yes. But for a Christian, you got to believe in something none of us have ever seen. And for some reason, the big problem miracle in the Bible is Jonah. Is that a whale of a tale or a tale of a whale? I mean, what is the deal with Jonah? Can you actually believe in Jonah? Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? It's not the resurrection, no. The greatest miracle in the Bible is... I got some of you a second time. Yeah. The greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible. I mean, if it's true that God can create the universe out of nothing, can he do whatever he wants that's not logically impossible inside the universe? Of course he can. If he can create the whole show out of nothing, then raising Jesus from the dead, the Noah miracle, the Jonah miracle, those are easy. Of course Noah's crazy unless God exists. Of course resurrections don't occur unless God exists. Of course Jonah's a fairy tale unless God exists. Now here's the real interesting part. Even the atheists are admitting the evidence for the first verse. They don't think it's God, but what else could it be? We've already been through this. It's certainly not gravity. There's a mind behind the universe, a self-existing mind that created all this. And if he has done that, can he do these other miracles? Of course he can. Now, I said something a minute ago you might not agree with. I said, God can do whatever he wants. It's not logically impossible. And some of you are thinking, logically impossible? What's this logically impossible stuff? I thought God can do anything. No, there's even some things God can't do. What? He can't do logically impossible things. Like he can't create a square circle. Right? Can't create a one-ended stick. Doesn't exist. Can't create a married bachelor. I know some guys try, but no. Okay? Don't exist. Okay? Can't create a five-sided triangle. Doesn't exist. Can't create an honest politician. Okay? There are some things that are just too hard for God. In fact, you can do some things that God can't do. What can you do that he can't do? Sin, lie, change, right? If he could sin, he wouldn't be the standard of truth and righteousness. Or if he could lie, he wouldn't be the standard of truth. He can't go out of existence. He's confined by his good nature. So it doesn't mean God can do anything. It means he can do anything that's logically possible. Now, there's a lot of people who will say, well, I can't believe in God because, or I can't believe in miracles because I've never seen one. That's not a good reason to disbelieve something necessarily. Why? Because you believe in a lot of things you've never seen. You believe in your mind. Have you ever seen it? You're using it right now, I hope. You believe in the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics. Have you ever seen those? No, you've never seen them, yet you believe in them anyway. You believe in justice. Have you ever seen justice? Oh, you may have been treated justly or unjustly, but you've never seen justice in itself because it's not something you see. It's an immaterial reality grounded in the nature of God. You've never seen love, and everybody believes in love. In fact, many years ago, I had a couple of debates with Christopher Hitchens. You guys remember Christopher Hitchens? He was a brilliant British atheist who sounded more brilliant than he was because he had a British accent. Anyway, at our second debate at the College of New Jersey, you can see these on our YouTube channel, by the way, there's a kid in the audience that asked Christopher this question. He said, Christopher, what is love? And Christopher, being a materialist, thinking that all that exists are molecules in motion, that we're nothing but moist robots. His answer, after he hemmed and hawed for a while, he said, love is a chemical. And I said, don't tell that to your wife. Honey, do you love me? Yeah. Why? Well, I got the chemical today. Tomorrow I might not have it. No, love isn't a chemical. It's a decision to seek what's best for the other person. You don't see it. It's grounded in the nature of God, but you believe in it. And by the way, love does not mean approval, ladies and gentlemen. We have this odd view in America that love means approval. If you love me, you'll approve of everything I do. Let me ask you guys a question. First of all, how many parents do we have in here? All right, how many former children do we have in here? Okay, good. That's all of us then. Question. If your parents approved of everything you wanted to do when you were 13, would they have been loving? No, they'd have been unloving. You can't approve of everything a 13-year-old wants to do. You wouldn't be loving them. You'd be enabling them to do evil. You need to stand in the way of evil. Love doesn't mean approval. Love means seeking what's best for the other person, and that often means you can't approve of what they do. So don't buy into this idea that love means approval. Love exists, but you don't see it. You've never seen gravity. Oh, Frank, there it is right there. You're not seeing gravity. What are you seeing? You're seeing the effects of gravity. We don't even know what gravity is. Do you know that? We're not really sure. You've never seen George Washington. Yet you believe he existed. Why? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by a man who lived from 1732 to 1799. You've never seen Jesus in the flesh either, but you believe he existed. Why? Because he's left effects behind. And if Christianity is true, there's also the Holy Spirit. And you can sense that effect. So you believe in a lot of things you've never seen. And by the way, do you realize that miracles do not need to happen today for Christianity to be true? There could be no miracles since the first century and Christianity would still be true. Now, I think miracles have occurred and do occur now, but you don't need them to show that Christianity is true. And if miracles do occur, you ought not expect to see many of them. Why? Because if miracles occurred all the time, they wouldn't get our attention as special acts of God. We'd say, hey, this stuff happens all the time. I mean, what would happen if people rose from the dead routinely? What would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? Nothing. You go to somebody and you go, hey, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle Leroy just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back. No, it's got to be a rare event if it's going to get our attention. If you read the literature on this, you're going to see atheists discounting miracles because they're rare events. Well, that's the very quality that makes them important. If they happened all the time, they wouldn't get our attention. And by the way, there are things that happen in our lives every day that are so spectacular. But since they occur every day, we sometimes miss them. Like, how many people in here have seen your own flesh and blood born? Every mother should raise your hand. I'm asking the fathers now. Now, when you see your own flesh and blood come either out of you or another human being, you don't go, evolution! Right? You go, this is amazing. How did this happen? We made whoopee 9 months ago, and now look at this. It happens every day. We don't call it a miracle, yet it's spectacular. You know, there's design behind it. In fact, biologist Ariel Ross said this: God never did a miracle to convince an atheist because his everyday works provide sufficient evidence. You see it all around you. So miracles are possible since God exists, but the key question, is the New Testament true? On one particular event that we need to look at, and that is the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I want to spend a little bit more time than normal on this, because if Jesus has risen from the dead, then Christianity is true. End of story. And let's look at Christianity and 2 lines of evidence. In the book, we have the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. We don't have time for 10. We're just going to look at 2. And the first one we're going to look at is something called embarrassing stories. What are embarrassing stories? Embarrassing stories, or the criteria of embarrassment, as historians would call it, is this. When they find something in the text that's embarrassing to the author or authors, they say, that's probably true. Why do you think it would be true? Because you're never going to invent things that embarrass yourself. You might invent things that make you look good, but you won't invent things that make you look bad. In fact, let me ask you guys a question in here. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look good? If you don't have your hand up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good. And it's not working. We know you're lying. All right, how many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look bad? No, you don't lie to make yourself look bad. You might lie to make yourself look good, but you won't lie to embarrass yourself. Well, the New Testament writers have filled the New Testament with embarrassing stories and details they never would have invented. That's why we call this the duh factor. They're not making this up. Let me just give you a few of them. Jesus calls the leader of the apostles, Peter, Satan. Do you think Mark, who wrote this down, at one point said to Peter, hey, Pete, I'm going to make this a real interesting story. I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What do you think Peter would have said? Have him call you Satan. This doesn't look good. I'm the leader. And then Peter says, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He denies him 3 times. And then at the crucifixion, all the disciples, maybe with the exception of one, they all run away for fear of the Jews. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away! They all run away. And who are the brave ones that stay behind? The women. That's right, ladies. You can give yourselves a hand. That's right. I am woman. Hear me roar. Did not run away like you sissy pants men did. Now, who wrote the New Testament documents down? Men. Now, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here invent that? I mean, if I was inventing it, I'd make myself look good. I'd write something down like this. Let's see. We marched right down there and we overpowered that elite Roman guard. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. What do you think? John said, get out. Peter roundhouse kicked him. Thomas said, we'll be back. No doubt. Some of you will get that tomorrow. And then on Sunday morning, we marched right down to the tomb, and we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. I would never say it was Mr. Sissy Pants while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. No, by the way, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses in that culture, independent of the embarrassment to men? Why would you never say that? Yes, because a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you're making this up and want credibility, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were, and one of them was a formerly demon-possessed woman. Gee, what a credible witness you got there. No, they're not inventing this. It's embarrassing on all fronts. I actually had a lady come up to me once. She said, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I hadn't thought of that. Because ladies, when your man comes home from work, does he say much? There could have been a nuclear explosion down at the plant. He's not going to tell you. You'll see it on the news before you hear it from him. You'll be watching the news going, hey, hon, what? Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you. Yeah. Nuke blew up. I've been hot for 3 days. What's for dinner? He's not going to tell you. In fact, I was at the University of Cincinnati last year, and I was telling this story, and afterward, a guy came up to me. He said, you think that's bad? I had a friend who was on a private plane, just he and the pilot died. And he didn't know how to land the plane. So just like in the movies, the tower talked him down. He went home that night, and his wife said, how was your day, dear? And he said, same old, same old. I can't even believe this next verse is in the New Testament, but it is. You know when Jesus takes his disciples up on the mountain there in Galilee and gives them the Great Commission? And they're there, and it's the climax of the biography of the gospel. And he says, go therefore, make disciples of all nations. Notice he doesn't say make believers. He says make disciples. There's a difference. Anyway, it says right there in verse 17, of the disciples watching him, it says, some believed, but some doubted. What? He's standing resurrected right in front of them, and they're going, you see that guy over there? Yeah. That guy over there is Jesus. Oh, no, it can't be Jesus. He was just killed not long ago. No, I'm telling you, it's him. It's Jesus. It can't be. It is. Do you know what they did to Jesus? They whipped him. They put nails in him. They put a spear in his side. Blood and water came out. He's dead. In fact, if the Romans didn't kill him, they could have been killed. They could have been killed for not killing him. I'm telling you, Jesus is dead. It's him. It can't be. It is. How do you know? The women told me. They're not making this up. There's even potentially embarrassing details about Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, it says that Jesus' own family thought he was out of his mind and they wanted to take him home. How embarrassing is that? His own brothers don't believe in him. John chapter 7. We learn later, however, that James, the half-brother of Jesus, dies 30 years later as a martyr, as the pastor in the church in Jerusalem. The guy that wrote the book of James. And the Bible doesn't tell us this. You know who tells us this? Josephus, a Jewish historian. He tells us this. And another writer, Hegesippus. They say that James dies at the hands of the Sanhedrin in 62 AD. Now, why would James not believe his brother was God, yet 30 years later, in the same city, Jesus is alleged to have risen from the dead, and he's martyred for his brother? The earliest evidence for the resurrection in the entire Bible is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. It's a creed. You can read it later. But in that early creed, which goes all the way back to the event itself, it says that among the people Jesus appeared to, it was James. That must have convinced him. Before Jesus rose from the dead, he said to his brother, yo, bro, you're not God. After the resurrection, he said, yo, bro, you're God. Now, how many people in here have a brother? All right, how many people have a brother who thinks he's God? Yeah, you don't believe in him either, do you? Neither did James. Jesus is called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. You think they invented this? Hey, they're calling the Lord demon-possessed. No, they're not making it up. And then Jesus has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. Oh, by the way, there are two prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline. Who are they? Rahab and Tamar. Now, do you think that Matthew, when he wrote down the genealogy, said to himself, you know what, I really think I need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let me put a couple of prostitutes in here. Rahab, Tamar. No! In fact, there's a lot of shady people in the bloodline. Judah, from where we get the term Jew from, the fourth son of Jacob. Jesus from the tribe of Judah, not a good guy. Judah's the guy that sold his brother Joseph into slavery in Egypt, and he's the guy that slept with his daughter-in-law posing as a prostitute, Tamar. And yet he's in the bloodline of the Messiah. David, a man after God's own heart. Yeah, but he's a liar, adulterer, and a murderer. Gee, I guess there's hope for the rest of us then, huh? How about Bathsheba? In fact, when Matthew gets to Bathsheba in the genealogy, he doesn't mention her name. What does he say instead? Uriah's wife. Who's Uriah? Husband of David. Husband of David. And David loved Jonathan. Husband of Bathsheba, whom David had killed. So he could have Bathsheba, he could cover up the crime. This is not invented. You don't find this in other histories. Any Pharaoh would chop the head off of his historian if the historian said, you know, Pharaoh, you come from prostitutes and you're demon-possessed. Who would ever do that? Nobody would. In fact, Dennis Prager, some of you guys know who Dennis Prager is? Conservative Jewish believer, radio host, says, one of the reasons I know the Old Testament's true is because nobody would invent such an embarrassing history of themselves. What I would ask Dennis, if embarrassing testimony works for the Old Testament, why doesn't it work for the New? There's plenty of embarrassing things in the New. They're not inventing this. Oh, one more thing. Jesus is hung on a tree. If you were making this up, you'd never do that. Why? Because according to Deuteronomy 21:23, anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. If you're making up a Messiah to the Jews, you'd never hang him on a tree. But he was hung on a tree. In fact, think about this, ladies and gentlemen. What are the two trees you find in Genesis? Tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Fast forward all the way to Revelation. Bible's very symmetrical. What tree do you find? Tree of life. Do you know there's a tree in the middle upon which they hung Jesus? Because we sinned at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the only way, again, we were going to get access to the tree of life is if they hung Jesus on the tree on which he was hung. But if you were making this up to the Jews, you'd never say this. There's a lot more in the book, but we got to do one more, and that is excruciating deaths. And this is the argument that says these men who are in a position to know whether Jesus had resurrected or not died excruciating deaths when they could have saved themselves by saying, look, it never happened. Now, it's really important to understand that all the writers of the New Testament, with the exception of Luke, all of them were all Jewish believers in Yahweh. They thought they were God's chosen people. Only Luke is a Gentile. All the rest of them are Jews. In fact, let's look at the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection, because they made a radical shift in their theology. Before the resurrection, they believed in animal sacrifice. They've been slaying lambs to Yahweh for hundreds of years. Then suddenly Jesus comes along and they go, you know, we don't need to slay these lambs anymore because these lambs are just symbols of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Here he is. Before, they believed in the binding law of Moses. Afterwards, Christ's life has fulfilled the binding law of Moses. Before, they believed in strict monotheism. Afterwards, they're believing in a Trinity. 3 persons in one divine essence. Yes, you can find the Trinity in the Old Testament, but it's much clearer in the New. Before, they believed in the Sabbath. In fact, they thought they could be stoned for not obeying the Sabbath. Afterwards, they're worshiping on Sunday, and Paul even says, don't let anyone tell you have to obey any Sabbath or festival day. Why? Because the Sabbath has arrived. The rest has arrived. Who's the rest? Jesus is the rest. Before, they believed in a conquering Messiah. Afterwards, a sacrificial Messiah. Before, they believed in circumcision. Afterwards, they believed in baptism and communion. Now, one more thing, ladies and gentlemen. What invented religion would ever pick this as their sign? What do I got to do to join your club? What? I'm out. This is not invented. Now, what would have caused these people to abandon everything on the left and adopt everything on the right virtually overnight? The only thing I can think of is what psychologists call an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is an event that occurs in your life that is so dramatic that it can change your perspective 180 degrees immediately. Some impact events are so dramatic that although you might not remember what you had for breakfast this morning, you'll remember an impact event that happened 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago if you're old enough. In fact, there's probably only a few of you in this room that can answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's particularly appropriate for Dallas, Texas. If you can remember where you were and what you were doing November 22nd, 1963, hold your hand up and hold it up high. Ladies and gentlemen, you see these people with their hands up? These people are very old. November 22nd, 1963 is my earliest memory. I was 2 years old in 2 days. Yes, I'm 62 years old now. I know. I don't look a day over 61. Actually, when I turned 50, my wife was very encouraging. She said, honey, you're going to live to be 100. I said, how do you know? She said, because you look half dead already. Anyway, I'm 2 years old in 2 days. I'm standing as a toddler in our home in Wanamassa, New Jersey, and my mother is weeping uncontrollably, sitting on an ottoman in front of a black and white TV. Mommy, what's the matter? What's the matter? Never saw my mother cry like that. They killed the president. They killed the president. President Kennedy assassinated that day. Was anybody there? You were in the audience? You're never going to forget that. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? I was in my home office in Charlotte, North Carolina, just outside it. I had the TV on behind me. I'd seen the first tower had been hit, but I didn't know by what. And I was on the phone to a pastor on the north side of Charlotte, and we were talking about what the topic would be when I came to speak at his church. And I said, do you have the TV on? He goes, yeah. I said, maybe a Cessna hit the World Trade Tower. You know, that had happened before sometimes up in New York buildings. And we're just talking. My back is still to the TV, and he says, the second tower just got hit. I turned around and looked at the TV. The second tower's on fire. I said, Was it a Cessna? He goes, no, it's like a United plane. A United plane? Yeah, it flew right in there. I said, you saw that? He goes, it was on live TV. I said, look, let me call you back. I hung up the phone. And for some reason that morning I had CNN on. The Communist News Network. And I'm not making this up, but the commentator on CNN said this: one has to think there's some sort of navigational error here. He said, navigational error? You dimwit. This is the clearest day in the history of the Big Apple. You think the pilots can't see where they're going? I mean, you think Stevie Wonder's flying these planes? I mean, come on. This is terrorism. I called that pastor the next day. I said, we're going to come to your church and talk about Islam because that's what this is related to. Now, 9/11 was almost 23 years ago. What's today, the 5th? Yep. 6 days. 23 years ago. And for those who are old enough, you can remember something about that day. But if I were to ask you where you were 23 days ago, most of you are going to go, let me look at my iPhone. What was I doing that? I don't know. Why can you remember something from 23 years ago but not 23 days ago? No impact event 23 days ago. Impact event 23 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, do you think if Jesus really rose from the dead, that would have been an impact event? Do you think they would have had any trouble remembering what happened or what he said and did, especially if he did miracles over the next 40 days? No, that would be no problem. That's the only way I could figure out why they went from here to here overnight under the threat of death. In fact, what did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up this new religion? Remember, they're Jews. They didn't get anything. They got kicked out of the synagogue, and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. We are? Yeah. What's it going to get us? First, we get kicked out of the synagogue, then we'll get beaten, tortured, and killed. Well, sign me up. You know, what a great idea. Why haven't we thought of this earlier? No, they're not making it up. And then they had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. Now, sometimes I get the question, and maybe you do too, are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles? Yeah, there's like maybe a dozen or so within 150 years of his life, and they're all in chapter 9 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. But you know what's really sort of underneath that question quite a bit? An illicit assumption. What's the illicit assumption? Well, you really can't trust these people because, you see, these people had an axe to grind. These people were biased. You can only trust the non-Christian writers to tell us what really happened. Now, if you think about this for more than 5 seconds, you realize how stupid that assumption is. What did these people have to gain by saying it was true? They had everything to lose by saying it was true from a temporal perspective. Some of you may know my friend J. Warner Wallace. He's a cold case homicide detective who's been on Dateline more than any other homicide detective because he solves murders that are decades old. And Jim, who also wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity and many other books, coldcasechristianity.com is a great place to go for this kind of material. Jim used his detective skills to investigate the greatest homicide of all time, the homicide of Jesus. But he also says that whenever he finds a body that he knows has been murdered, he says, I don't need to track down 1,000 possible motivations. I know that that guy was murdered for one or more of these 3 reasons. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue. Sex, money, or power. Sex, money, or power are the 3 motivators that can motivate people to murder, and they're the same motivators that can motivate any of us to sin. Why? Because sex, money, and power are good things. In fact, they're so good that we'll often take shortcuts to get them. So Jim says that if you're going to say that they invented all this, the New Testament writers, he says that you got to find one or more of those 3 motivators. So let's take a look at the 3 motivators in the lives of the apostles. Ladies and gentlemen, did the New Testament writers suddenly get real popular with the ladies for saying Jesus had resurrected from the dead? No, they didn't get sex. Did they get money? No, they weren't 21st century prosperity gospel preachers. Did they get power? No, they got the opposite of power. They got persecuted. Paul had power when he was persecuting the church. As soon as he becomes a Christian, he's the one persecuted. They didn't get sex. They didn't get money. They didn't get power. They're not making this up. And then why would they die for a known lie? At this point, you want to say, time out, Frank. Are you going to tell me that martyrdom proves Christianity? If you're going to say that, don't you have to say it's evidence for Islam too? No, you don't. Why? Because there's a big difference between the Muslim martyrs of today and the New Testament martyrs of New Testament times. There's a lot of differences, but let me just give you one. The Muslim martyrs, either now or in Muhammad's time, in the 600s AD, didn't witness anything or haven't witnessed anything that tells them that Islam is true. They just have faith. But the New Testament martyrs saw the risen Jesus. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. Some people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. You can't get better evidence than that unless you were there yourself. All right, last thing I'm going to say about this. For those of you that believe the Bible's inerrant like I do, it's going to sound like heresy for a minute, but it's not. Stick with me. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You say, how can that be? Ladies and gentlemen, do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written? Why? Because they witnessed the resurrected Jesus. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, Christianity did not begin with a book. Christianity began with an event, the resurrection. If there was no resurrection, there would be no series of books that we call the New Testament. Jews would never write down that a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead because they thought a man claiming to be God was blasphemy, and they didn't think one guy would rise from the dead in the middle of time. But that's exactly what happened. In fact, we can put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. You wouldn't have these documents written down by Jews in the first century claiming all this unless it really occurred. Okay? Now, I just gave you a couple embarrassing and excruciating deaths. There's other reasons to believe the New Testament writers are telling the truth, but we don't have time for that. The overall argument is this. Does truth exist? If somebody says there's no truth, you're going to say, is that true? Does God exist? Yes. What's the first argument? Cosmological. The beginning of the universe, I just mentioned, the design argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument. Are miracles possible? What's the greatest miracle in the Bible? Genesis 1:1, and even atheists are admitting the evidence for Genesis 1:1. And did Jesus rise from the dead? We just went through 2 lines of evidence. There are many more. We couldn't bring books here, but if you take you follow the lead on that QR code, I'm going to send you this entire PowerPoint presentation in a PDF format. In fact, I probably showed you maybe 60 slides tonight. The whole presentation has 362. So if you want to get the whole thing, do that. If that QR code isn't working, you can also get the same thing by texting this word evidence to this phone number, 855-909-0582. You can also get these books on our website or Amazon. And if you get them from our website, all the proceeds from the sale of the books and the DVDs will go to feed needy children. Mine. Okay? Just so you know. All right? I'll put that up again at the end because we're almost done. It's true. Christianity's true. So what? So what if it's true? You're probably thinking, hey, what's in it for me? So what if it's true? Well, the best news of all, ladies and gentlemen, is someone actually did die for you. Now, when I was in the Navy, I was in naval aviation, so we had to earn golden wings, which were fairly hard to earn. But there's nothing more difficult in the Navy to earn than a golden trident. Very few people that start SEAL training make it through, maybe 5%. Those that do make it through wear that trident with pride. It is their identity. When Michael Monsoor was buried in Rosecrans Cemetery in San Diego, California, just about every Navy SEAL on the West Coast showed up for his funeral. And when they passed his casket, they took their tridents and they pressed them into his casket. They took their identity and put their identity in the one that died for them, the one that sacrificed for them. That's what we're supposed to do. But our culture says, oh no, don't put your identity in your Savior. Put your identity in your political party, or put your identity in your ethnicity, or put your identity in your sexual preference, or put your identity in your gender identity, or put your identity in your job, or your bank account, or another person even. Ladies and gentlemen, do you realize those are extremely fragile identities? For example, what if you put your identity in your sexual preference? What happens when you can no longer sexually perform? You no longer have an identity? Or you're no longer sexually preferred? You no longer have an identity? What if you put your identity in your job? What happens when you lose your job? You no longer have an identity? Even if another person you put your identity in, what happens when, God forbid, that person leaves you or dies? You no longer have an identity? Do you realize Christianity is the only worldview where you don't achieve your identity, you receive your identity? You just accept what Christ has done. Because he went to the cross, paid for your sin and my sin, and then rose from the dead to prove it. And do you realize that everyone you love will die? Everything you build will crumble. Everything you say will be forgotten. Everything you do will come to nothing. You and your identity will die and vanish unless the resurrection's true. If there is no resurrection, you're just polishing the deck chairs on the Titanic. Nothing's going to matter, ultimately. But thankfully, the resurrection is true, and Christianity, therefore, is as well. And you have an opportunity to get an identity you can't lose. You don't achieve it, you simply receive it. And if you haven't received it, why not? It's free. All right, so what we're going to do now is move to questions. But before we go to questions, I want Kenneth to come up because we don't want this event to just be an event. We want you to know that if you want to go further into this kind of teaching and apologetics, there's a place on campus you can do so. So Kenneth, tell people where they can actually, if you can't put the thing up, it's no big deal. You got it? Okay. You can follow a QR code right there. Yeah. Go ahead. Tell them about it.
Thank you, Dr. Turek. Mm-hmm. All right. Can we handle the truth? It's hard, but it's also easy. If you like what you saw tonight, I hope that you'll continue to come. If you don't like what you saw tonight, I hope that you'll continue to come
and ask questions. Because we don't want to just say we believe this dogmatically and we can't stand up to scrutiny. That is what a reasonable faith ought to be. And what do you know is the name of our club? Usually we meet on Tuesday nights. This next Tuesday is another special event where we are inviting Dr. Casey Luskin from the Discovery Institute to give us a talk answering this question, does science disprove a historical Adam and Eve? That one is shaping up to be a really interesting conversation, so I hope you'll join us the 10th in Green Hall. Probably, that actually might be tentative though, because I see quite a few people here. So just so I know, how many people here find this interesting? There's a good chance that you'll come. Okay. All right. Hallelujah. We may need a bigger room. We'll take a look at that. Very good. So after this, the Saturday after this, we have, this event is public, by the way. Please leave yourself some time to park as well, because this area called Green Hall of the campus is heavily under construction right now. So if you want to double or nothing the parking at UTD, you'll have to leave yourself some time. The Saturday following this is our monthly Pancakes and Pontification event, where we will make a bunch of pancakes, and then we will talk about any matter of apologetics and spirituality that might interest you. This one is less of a public event, so if you are a UT Dallas student, I invite you to join our Discord channel right there, and we will give you updates on that. If you're not a UT Dallas student, please follow our social media, because we will have directions to our weekly live streams with really interesting things that everybody is welcome to see. And after those two events, we will return to our regularly scheduled programming of Tuesday nights at 7 will be talk, a little bit more discussion style things where everybody has the opportunity to ask questions in more of a smaller group setting. Right across this hallway here in the room SSA 12.471. This is the kind of thing we do, and so now I will turn it back to Dr. Turek.
All right, thanks, Ken. Questions now, and since no one likes to ask the first question, we're moving right on to the second question. Second question at the microphone. As soon as one person starts, we're off and running. So just go to a question if you can, rather than a speech, so we can fit in as many as possible. All right. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hi, my name's Liam. I'm a Christian, so I'm not
all right.
Catholic. But I am just curious. You had a conversation about the book Separates for Sale not too long ago, and for someone who's looking at different churches just because he sees the churches around them just falling away, so to speak, being more of a afraid to speak the truth, what would you recommend for people that just want a church but really don't see anything around them that's suitable?
Well, one of the things you can do is call local seminaries. Like there's a very good seminary here in town, Dallas Theological Seminary. In fact, Ryan Cruz right here is on our board. He is a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, and they have obviously pastors all over the country. And so if you call DTS, you can say, hey, do you have a pastor-led church in this general area? And they will give you that kind of information. Now, it doesn't guarantee it's going to be a good church, but if they come from a good seminary, it probably will be. Our seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary, same thing, ses.edu. So find good seminaries and then call the seminary or go online. Probably have to call them to figure out where their alumni are, but that's a good way to try and find out.
Thank you.
All right, good question. All right, yes, sir, what's your name?
My name is David.
Hey, David, go ahead.
Just want to say thank you for being here tonight.
Yes, sir.
I just have I wrote these down, but it's only one, of course. But I just wanted to ask, let's see if I can find it. How do Christians determine what parts of the Bible are prescriptive and which are descriptive?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, we have an online course called How to Interpret Your Bible. And for those of you who are Christians in here, can I just ask you guys a question? How many people in here have ever gone to a church where they gave you a pretty good course or discussion group on how to interpret the Bible? Okay, maybe 20% of us. Okay, I don't know if everyone's a Christian here, but you would think that would be the first thing that a church would teach. If it is God's Word, how do we interpret it properly? And so we created this course, How to Interpret Your Bible, and we have this acronym, STOP, S-T-O-P. I'll just go through it very briefly. Whenever you come across a Bible passage, you have to discover at least these four things. Situation, what's going on in the text? You just can't pull a verse out like we mentioned earlier. You got to know what's going on. What's the situation? T, what type of literature is this? Is this a parable? Is this law? Is this prophecy? Is this a gospel? Is this an epistle? What is this? Because you're going to interpret poetry, say, differently than law, right? The O, who's the object of the passage? And you might say in the passage we talked about earlier, Jeremiah 29:11, the object of the passage are the exiles that were taken to Babylon. It's not 21st century Christians living in America today. That's who the passage was written to, so you need to know that. And the P stands for, is this passage prescriptive or descriptive? And I would submit that a majority of the Bible is merely descriptive. It's just telling you what happened. It's not saying you ought to do it too. Like it tells us that David committed adultery with Bathsheba. That's descriptive. Right. It's not prescriptive for us. I got to find Bathsheba out there. No. Okay? And so it can be difficult to discover whether it's descriptive or prescriptive. You need to look at the context of the passage to see what's going on. Generally, the most prescriptive passages in the Bible are in the epistles. Those are the letters from Romans all the way to just before you get to Revelation to Jude, okay? All of those books that were written by Paul, by Peter, by Jude, by John, by the writer of Hebrews, by James, those books, word for word, have the most application in them, prescriptive to us, because they trade on everything that's happened to that point, and most of those books are either written to churches or individuals on how to live the Christian life. Of course, there are passages from Jesus that are prescriptive as well, but a lot of the Old Testament is not prescriptive for Christians today. The law from Exodus 20 to the end of Deuteronomy is now a description for us, because that's Old Covenant, and the writer of Hebrews says the Old Covenant is obsolete. It can be instructive. It can help us understand what God is like. Some of those passages are repeated in the New Testament. Now, those are prescriptive, but generally the Old Covenant is superseded by the New, and so those passages might not be applicable to us today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Well put.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it. All right.
Hey
yes,
there.
sir. What's your name?
Pardon me. My name is Matt.
Hey, Matt. Go
Nice
ahead.
to meet you, Dr. Turek. I've got a layered question that requires just a little bit of groundwork. I hope that's okay.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
All
right. Get to your question.
To the question, why would an eternally self-sufficient God create a temporal universe like the one that we're living in? I think Scripture answers the three answers that I would come up with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Ephesians chapter 3, Paul says that to make the manifold wisdom of God to evident in the heavenly realm, the church is for that purpose, and you know, you need creation to get the church. Colossians 1 says that he wanted to put his son first in all things, and you know, creation does that as well for his son. In a general sense, God is love, and he wants to share love. You know, he wants to share that love that he had eternally with Father, Son, and Spirit. He wants to share that with his creation. As a Christian myself, I'm sympathetic to all of those, and they make sense to me, and I'm thankful that God created things. I have found, you know, in my apologetic efforts that atheists and skeptics are not sympathetic to those at all, and they're non-starters, because, you know, to say that the manifold wisdom of God is a reason for creation, well, that makes him sound like he's just you know, it was done for himself. To say that Jesus, that he wanted to put his son first, well, you know, no atheist is really sympathetic to that. And to say that God did it for love, I think we have to concede that, you know, a great deal of God's creation goes through evil and suffering, and ultimately a great deal of creation is lost. I think you believe in eternal hell, and you know, Jesus said most would not enter the gate. And so how do you approach that from an apologetic perspective? What would you say to someone who
Well, first of all, God
with that?
didn't need to create, because
Right.
he's perfectly self-sufficient in the Trinity, a lover, a loved one, and a spirit of love. The scriptures say he created for his glory,
Yes.
but it's not for his benefit, because he doesn't need anything, being an infinite being, a self-sufficient being.
Yeah.
We're the ones that get the benefit of his creation. So when you praise God, and it's going to sound odd, this is called impassibility, you don't add to God by praising him. And you don't take away from God by cursing him. Who gets the benefit of praise and the detriment of cursing? We do. Since God loves us, he wants us to praise him, not for his benefit, but for ours.
Certainly.
Okay? So God, as a loving being, chose, not that he needed to create, but chose to create creatures that he could have a love relationship with. But it's for our benefit, not for his.
It is. I suppose that almost presupposes that creation was necessary, because the argument would be, you know, God created knowing that it would lead to a great deal of suffering when he didn't have to, you know, and it would lead to most of his creation in hell, most of his human creation in hell.
Well, we're not exactly sure who's going to be in hell. I
That's
mean,
true.
there's theologians like Doug Grotice, who makes a case that there'll be more people in heaven than you think on Christ's sacrifice, okay? But that all presupposes a moral standard. And here's the moral standard, the moral question we need to ask. Because sometimes you hear people say, well, why didn't God create a universe where everyone believed, right? What might be logically possible might not actually be achievable with free creatures. Because one thing God can't do is he can't force free creatures to do what he wants. Because if he does force them, then they're not free. And if he does force them, it's not love. Love must be freely given. So God creates a universe where the maximum number of people are saved and the minimum number of people are lost based on their own free choice. Here's the question. Is God under a moral obligation to not create because some people decide they don't want him?
He's not.
Okay, good. Then that's the answer to the question. God can create because he gives everybody the ability to accept salvation, but some people willingly reject him.
Okay. I'll ask just one more and then I'll go. But I guess to phrase it just as succinctly as possible, what about creation, from an eternally self-sufficient God, what about creation was worth those who would suffer eternally, if that's going to happen?
Well, I know this is going to sound odd for just a second. People that suffer in hell are getting justice, and justice is good.
Sure, but God knew that. I mean,
sure he did.
He knew that would happen, and he chose yet to do it.
And we knew that when we had children, at some point, they would rebel against us, and we chose to do it anyway. Why?
For love. Yeah.
Yes, because God can bring good from evil. And this is what Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 4, when he says, our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us a greater weight of glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, for what is seen is temporary. We fix our eyes on what is unseen, for what is unseen is eternal. And by definition, since God is just, nobody in the afterlife is going to get a raw deal. Everybody is either going to get one of two things. You're either going to get grace or you're going to get justice. Does anyone in here want justice? I don't want justice. I want grace. People who have rejected grace get justice, and justice is a good thing.
Amen. I appreciate you and everything you do. Thank you.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
Caleb.
Caleb, go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank you for being here. I'm a huge fan of your work. I just wanted to ask, I've been hearing a lot recently about Catholicism and that topic. I just wanted to simply ask, is there anything that is biblically incorrect in Catholicism? And if so, how can we prove it's incorrect?
How much time do we have? First of all, I was brought up in the Catholic Church. I went to Catholic high school. And there's no way I'm going to be able to answer that in a robust way in a couple of minutes, but I will recommend a book called Roman Catholics and Evangelicals, Agreements and Differences by my co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, and another gentleman by the name of Ralph McKenzie. This book is 30 years old, but it's still the standard work on the topic. And it's even endorsed by Roman Catholics. So if you really want to get into the differences and the agreements of Roman Catholics and evangelicals, get that book. Now, let me say one other thing. Sometimes I get the question, do you think Catholics can be saved? And my answer is, I even think some Baptists can be saved. Okay? Because it's not where you go to church that saves you. And by the way, even the Roman Catholic Church agrees with that there are separated brethren, that they believe people can be saved even outside of the Catholic Church. Okay? But I have several problems with Roman Catholic practice and theology. Okay? But I think if you get that book, I think it would be very helpful. Now, probably the nub of all this, if you wanted to really get down to what's the difference, the major difference between Roman Catholics and, say, evangelical Protestants is who is the authority? Is the authority the Scriptures, or is the authority the Scriptures plus tradition plus church councils plus whatever the Pope says? And what I'm going to say is it's the Scriptures.
Thank you.
All right. Good question, Caleb. Yes, sir. Hey, what's your name?
I'm Bo.
Hey, Bo.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
You too.
Yeah, I have more practical questions.
Uh-huh.
I have the question of, if you had to pick 5 books, what would be the 5 books that were the most impactful for your education?
In what I do, apologetics, mean?
Yeah, I guess not apologetics. I've got your books for that.
Okay. No, not my books. You mean books I've read?
Yes.
In
books,
apologetics.
Yes.
Christian Apologetics by Norman Geisler. He was my mentor. That would be one. You Can't Go Without Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis would be another. Gee, that's hard because there's so many. As soon as I tell you one, I'm going to say, oh, I forgot about that one.
What about like theological books or philosophical books?
A very helpful philosophical book is by Ed Feser called Last Superstition. Ed Feser's a Catholic theologian, but he really goes after the new atheists and he teaches you philosophy along the way. So The Last Superstition is a great book, published about 2008. Anything by C.S. Lewis. I go back to C.S. Lewis quite a bit. Also, J. Budziszewski has some great books. J. Budziszewski is a professor at UT Austin, also Roman Catholic. My mentor, Dr. Geisler, when he died, they added up all the books he either wrote, co-wrote, or rewrote. It was 129. The guy's written more books than most people have seen in one place. Right? Who goes to the library anymore, right? So he has a ton of good books. Peter Kreeft has a good book on suffering called Making Sense of Suffering. Also, from a practical perspective, my friend Greg Kokel has a great book called Tactics, which help you interact with people. That's a book you definitely want to get. Real practical book on the culture. My friend Natasha Crane wrote a book called Faithfully Different. That will help you. And then you can go technical too. Anything by Stephen Meyer is great. William Lane Craig, Reasonable Faith, On Guard, Hard Questions, Real Answers. Those are all great books. One guy who does a great job in writing books is Lee Strobel because he interviews the top scholars and then he puts this highfalutin stuff into average language and anybody can understand it. So Gary Habermas's new magnum opus on the resurrection, you're not going to beat that. It's 1,200 pages. It's one of 5 volumes. Wow. And or 4 volumes. And only the first one is out. So, I mean, I could go on, but those are some great books.
Okay. And then, if you don't mind me asking, what does your prayer life look like, and what does your study life look like, and how do you balance it with Scripture, and then also?
Yeah, that's a tough question because in addition to studying, we also have a ministry, and just like everybody in here, you've got other things going on. So I try and do devotional in the morning, but I'm not a devotional reader where I'll just read a verse or that kind of thing. I'm trying to read through. I don't want to pull stuff out of context. I want to read through. In fact, a book I've been reading for the year, just a little bit each day, is a book called The Bible from 30,000 Feet by Skip Heitzig. Skip is a Calvary Chapel pastor out in Albuquerque, and it's a great book. It gives you the whole overview of the Bible and the major points of each book. So prayer life, I think I'd be lying if I said I had a great prayer life. But I'm praying a lot, but not in a situation where I'm spending hours. I'm praying mostly during the day, and I do some in the morning and at night when I'm going to sleep. But I think, for me anyway, that's a weakness. I could be praying more. I'm always, for me, I try and maximize all my dead time. What's dead time? Cutting the lawn, driving the car, doing housework. I'm listening. I either have the Bible on, or I have a podcast on, or a book on. I mean, why waste the time, right? So I think that's the way you can get up to speed on some of these things. There's so much information out there you really got to focus in on. So some of the podcasts I'll listen to Greg Kokel, I'll listen to William Lane Craig. I will listen to sometimes J. Warner Wallace, Elisa Childers, Natasha Crane. These are people I work with that have good insights. Sometimes I'll listen to Jordan Peterson. If Jordan has a guest on, the guest can, out of an hour and a half, he'll get like 15 minutes. But It's always good stuff, right? And there's other podcasts I pop in and out on certain occasions. So that's what I'm doing.
Awesome.
All right?
I really appreciate you.
All right,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much.
Yes, God bless. All right.
My
Yes, sir.
question is about. Oh,
What's
sorry.
your name?
Denton.
Denton, go ahead.
So
From
my question's
Denton,
about.
Texas? Are you from Denton?
No, I'm
Denton
not.
from Denton?
Nope.
No? Okay.
Nope. I was the only child born in the whole state of Texas out of both sides of the family, so it won't be a Texas name.
All right.
So that's why. So my question's about Calvinism.
Uh-huh.
So my in-laws are Calvinist. I want to know what the main, out of the 5 points, what is the main thing that's, for lack of a better term, wrong? What's wrong about Calvinism? Are you a Calvinist?
I don't know if we're predestined to talk about that tonight.
Well, I was predestined to ask, I guess you could say.
All right. And I was predestined to say we're not.
Well.
So God has given us conflicting.
That's right.
No. Probably the best place you can go for that, there are books on this. My co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, wrote a book called Chosen But Free, which is very good. Leighton Flowers, who's here in Texas, has a YouTube channel called Soteriology 101, which is very good. I'm not a Calvinist. I wasn't predestined to be. And I don't know about the 5 points. I'd probably say, each of those 5 points, it depends on how you define them.
Right, an interpretation.
Yeah, how you define unconditional election, right? How you define limited atonement.
Do we have free will for salvation?
Well, freely I choose to say we do. And if we don't, the whole world's a sham and God's the author of evil. See, the ultimate problem with Calvinism, hard 5-point Calvinism, in my view, is it makes the world a sham because we really don't have a free choice, but God is telling us that we ought to choose him when we can't choose him because he hasn't chosen us at all. And secondly, it makes God the author of evil. In fact, let me give you a debate that took place 40 years ago at Dallas Theological Seminary. It was between Norman Geisler, my mentor, and a guy by the name of John Gerstner, who was sort of a devotee of Jonathan Edwards, who was a Calvinist. And at one point, Geisler turned to Gerstner and he said, does man have free will? And Gerstner said, yes. Man has free will to do what he desires. But God gives him the desire of his heart. So Geisler said, who gave Adam the desire to sin? And Gerstner said, mystery. And Geisler said, contradiction. Probably one of the greatest Calvinists of the last century was R.C. Sproul. I love R.C. Sproul. I listen to a lot of R.C. Sproul, but he does the same thing. When you get down to who created or who caused Adam to sin, they punt to mystery. It's not a mystery. No one caused Adam to sin. Adam caused Adam to sin. He had a tempter too. It wasn't God. If God did it, then somehow Yahweh is Allah. And I think when you look at the scriptures on this, and you look at the scriptures properly, you realize that predestined doesn't mean you don't have a choice. Predestined means anybody who's in Christ is guaranteed to be glorified. Doesn't mean you don't have a choice. It means you're guaranteed to be glorified. So we could spend a lot more time on it, but I would ask the Calvinist those questions. Who caused Adam to sin? See what they say. All right?
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
Hey.
Hey, what's your name?
My name is Connor.
Connor, go ahead.
Denton kind of stole my question. It's
All right.
also about free will.
All right.
So the Pharaoh had a heart of stone, not letting the Israelites go, but God intervened by killing his son. Had the Pharaoh extended his own free will without divine intervention, the Israelites wouldn't have been freed.
Say that last part again, Connor.
Had the Pharaoh extended his own free will, the Israelites wouldn't have been freed.
Wouldn't have been freed?
Would you like to argue that?
Okay, no, I'm trying to see where the question's going. Is that a question or?
That's a statement. I'm getting to the question.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was, okay, I'm confused. Go ahead. Keep going.
So if we have
I won't harden my heart. Go ahead.
So if we have our own free will, then explain what happened to the Pharaoh, and if everything is just God's will, then what about people who are predestined to hell?
Say the last part again.
If everything is just God's will, then what about the people who are predestined to hell?
Okay. I don't believe that people are predestined to hell without their consent. Okay? If you read the passage in Exodus, and also it's in Romans 9, particularly though when you go back to Exodus, who hardened his heart first? Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then God completed the process. And if you read Romans 1, this is sort of what's going on in Romans 1. Paul says when you suppress the truth long enough, God gives you up to your own desires, and you engage in futile thinking to the point that you get a depraved mind, and you're not only doing evil, you're cheering on other people who are doing evil, which is a good description of our culture right now. Cheering on people who are doing evil. But the person that started the rebellion was the subject, in this case, Pharaoh. God just completed the process. Now, you need to know, go back to our acronym, STOP, S-T-O-P, the situation. You need to know the situation in Egypt to understand this more clearly. Because in Egypt, and we're going there, by the way, in December. Anyone want to go to Egypt and Saudi Arabia? We're going in December. Check our website out for more. In Egypt, their view of the afterlife was that in order for you to make it to paradise, after you died, your heart was put on a scale against a feather. And if your heart was lighter than a feather, you'd be admitted to the afterlife. If your heart was heavier than a feather, a demon goddess known as Ammit, who was part crocodile, part hippopotamus, and part lion, the three most fearsome animals of the Nile, that demon goddess would devour your heart and you wouldn't be admitted to the afterlife. So what Moses was saying to Pharaoh is, by your own theology, you're not going to make it. Your heart is hard. In other words, your heart is heavy and it's going to outweigh the feather because you're sinning against the only true God. So when you realize what the theology of the Egyptians was, then you can make more sense of why Moses is using those terms, and then Paul is quoting them later in the book of Romans. It didn't mean that Pharaoh didn't have a choice. It meant that he hardened his heart first, and then God completed the process, and by Pharaoh's own theology, he was doomed.
All right, thank you.
All right, good question. Thank you, Connor. By the way, you can see these drawings in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And it may be on some tombs over there in Egypt where you see Ammit sitting there next to the scale looking at the heart. Go ahead. Sorry, what's your name?
Ashton. My name is Ashton.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have somewhat of a layered question, so I could use a bit of exposition, but I just wanted to ask you about monism and how it relates to the problem of divine hiddenness. Like
Molinism?
Monism.
Monism?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my understanding of monism is that God is not only the creator of all things, but he is, in a sense, existence itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's some scriptural support for it. Like in Exodus, when God reveals his name to Moses, his name is I am that I am. And then we also see it in Paul's letters when he says that in him we move and have our being.
Yes.
In God we actually have our being.
Right.
And so by that logic, when it comes to the problem of divine hiddenness, it's sort of like a fish that's in water and is agnostic about the existence of water. So when it comes to the question of why doesn't God reveal himself or make it more obvious about his existence, it's hard to do it because he's just so ingrained in existence that he is existence itself. But according to monism, there's a distinction between creation and God. It's not pantheism. It's not that creation is God itself, but it's more of like a projection of God or a reflection of
right,
God.
but from a Christian worldview, we don't believe in monism, so...
So my question is, does monism have scriptural support, and then does it answer the problem of divine hiddenness, and then also how do you traditionally go about answering the question of divine hiddenness. If God wants everyone to be saved, why doesn't he make his existence more obvious?
Okay, let's just deal with the last part, because monism isn't part of the scriptures. It's,
okay.
You know, we're distinct. There are distinctions between us and God.
Yeah.
So divine hiddenness. There are several answers to why isn't God more overt. Could he be more overt? Of course he could be more overt, right? Why isn't he more overt? Notice that Jesus starts telling parables, and he starts telling people, or he starts telling his disciples, I'm telling these parables so the people who have their hearts open will understand it. Those that don't, won't. Why is God holding back? It might be because God knows that they would be more culpable if he was more overt, and he knows they're not going to believe anyway, so he doesn't make them more culpable, more responsible for being too overt. And C.S. Lewis talks about this. I believe it's in the Screwtape Letters, where he talks about God cannot ravish, he can only woo. If he's too overt, like sort of a stalker showing up all the time, you really wouldn't have plausible deniability. You really wouldn't have the ability to go, I don't want to have anything to do with God because he keeps showing up, right? You can turn away and go your own way. In fact, Soren Kierkegaard had a great sort of parable about this. He said, imagine that a young prince in his jurisdiction sees a young peasant woman who he immediately falls in love with and wants to make her the potential queen. He goes to his father and he said, I think I found my future wife. How do I win her? And the father says to him, son, you can't go to her as the prince, you know, with the chariots and the horns and the flags and all that, because she might then just come to you to want to be the queen and not love you for who you are. If you want to win that woman, you got to renounce the crown, go into that village as a peasant and win her as a peer. So what does he do? He renounces the crown and wins her as a peer. He adds humanity to his deity. He becomes a peer, a perfect peer, and he allows us to torture and kill him so he could take our punishment upon himself. Remember, God isn't just interested in belief that. Even the demons believe that God exists, but they tremble. God's interested in a love relationship, and that requires some distance. If he's too overt, you can't walk away.
Okay.
All right?
So sort of like the problem with problem of evil or problem of free will, God doesn't want to force us into a relationship. He wants us to come to that knowledge and understanding on our own. And so he sort of tests us by not being too overt.
It's been put this way. God gives us enough evidence to know that he exists, but he also leaves enough ambiguity to allow us to go our own way if we want to.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
All right, good question. Yes, sir, what's your name?
Thank you.
Yeah, come up to it, too.
I'm not going anywhere, I'm just getting something to drink. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just about a fall. Nice to meet you again. My name is Caleb.
Hey, Caleb.
Sorry if I'm a little stuttery. I'm bad at speaking in public.
You're doing fine. Go ahead. Just go to the question.
After contemplating in line, I realized there might be a high likelihood of me sounding really dumb when I ask this. So
You're
my
fine,
question.
Man. Go ahead.
So earlier, while you were I don't think preaching is the right word. But while you were giving your presentation, you talked about how when there's a, impact event. Yeah, impact event. You typically remember it very well, what you were doing in that moment and whatnot.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So I'm pretty sure that in Matthew, there's an earthquake or something that he mentions, but there's not in the other Gospels. And I was wondering, since that was an impact event, I get that it was a while in the future, but since it was an impact event, wouldn't it have made more sense for them to maybe all remember an earthquake?
You're talking about the tombs opening up in Matthew chapter 27?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Some people say, why isn't that in other passages? We don't know why it's in other passages. Mark is a shorter gospel. It doesn't contain a whole bunch. John is sort of a different gospel where he's talking more about the private conversations that Jesus had with people. So the only other possibility it would be in would probably be Luke. And Luke is the longest of all Gospels, and he appears to be running out of scroll by the time he gets to the end of his Gospel. And he compresses a whole bunch of events into a very short period of time. Apparently, he didn't think it was necessary to put in. Whereas Matthew is written to the Jews, trying to get Jews. The Old Testament saints maybe came out for a while, and then it doesn't say what happened to them after that. He's talking to Jews, so he wants to get Jews to believe. So we're speculating. We don't know why. But whether or not that particular event, I'm speaking as now not somebody who's assuming that the Bible is the Word of God, whether or not that particular event took place doesn't change whether or not the resurrection of Jesus really occurred. Okay? So we're speculating a bit to say, why isn't it in other passages? All of these gospel writers had a purpose, and they couldn't include everything.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. That was pretty dumb of me.
No, it wasn't. It's not a dumb question. You're asking questions that scholars ask. That's a good question, Caleb.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you might need to raise that, I'm pretty sure.
It's all good.
Be close to it if you can.
I'll just lean. It's all
Yes,
good.
sir. Go ahead. What's your name?
My name is Brian.
Hey, Brian.
I am a Christian, Dr. Turek, reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion.
Okay, good.
And
it's well written.
Tonight you outlined for 3 arguments for the existence of God. Cosmological argument, teleological argument, and the moral argument. And I've discovered in watching some of these debates that you've had with some of these atheists and reading some of their material that they engage with those 3 arguments as well. Obviously, they come to different conclusions. In Dawkins' book, for example, quick quote, he says, "It is tempting to believe that things so well designed must have had a designer." Teleological argument. Obviously, Dawkins does not concede the point, and he comes to a different conclusion. However, fun question for you tonight. Out of those 3 arguments, or any others that you know, which would you say are the strongest in favor of atheism? Or conversely, if you'd prefer to answer it a different way, which of the arguments on behalf of theism, or if you want Christianity, would you say are the weakest?
The banana argument. You guys know what I'm talking about.
I do not. Sorry.
Anyway, I don't find any of those arguments weak. And it really depends on the individual as to how persuasive. See, there's a difference between proof and persuasion. You can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, but it might not be persuasive to people. I will tell you what's more persuasive to the atheists among all these arguments is the fine-tuning of the universe. That argument, Hitchens, Dawkins, Krauss have all admitted this is probably their best argument, from their perspective anyway. The reason is because they have to come up with this grandiose, unverifiable answer that there are other universes out there to try and rescue them from the obvious conclusion that the universe is precisely designed to have life on it. And if it were changed just an infinitesimal amount in any direction among more than a dozen of these parameters, none of us would be here. And the odds are just astronomically low it could happen by chance, without an intelligence. So that's the best argument that they admit. Now, both Dawkins and Krauss, Lawrence Krauss, about 10 years ago, were touring the country doing their little song and dance about this, and they actually admitted on stage, one could make a reasonable argument for some sort of deistic God. Not that we would accept that, but basically the argument from the beginning of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe, they would say, oh, maybe there's a deistic God out there, meaning a God who created everything but doesn't get involved after that. Well, wait a minute. Deism is a lot closer to theism than it is to atheism. And why would you say that God is a deistic God? I think I know why. I'm speculating. Because a deistic God doesn't bring along morality with him. A theistic God does. A theistic God cares what you do and cares for you. They don't want the moral component. And many atheists admit this. Thomas Nagel, who is a brilliant philosopher at NYU, a number of years ago said, it's not that how did he put it? He said, He said, it's not that I don't believe in God, it's that I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be that way. And he said one of the most, I can't remember the exact word he used, I'm paraphrasing, one of the most challenging things for me, or scary things for me, is some of the most intelligent people I know are religious believers. See, he doesn't want there to be a God because he doesn't want the moral accountability that comes with God existing.
Could I ask you, so the weakest argument for theism that you have heard?
That I have heard, I try not to traffic in weak arguments.
Naturally.
So, I mean, look, people will argue over the ontological argument. That's why I don't use it. Some theists will say, great argument. Others will say it's ridiculous. So, you know, if you gave me 4, cosmological, teleological, moral, ontological's out.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Dr. Turek, I hate to move the party here on that here, but we have till about 9:35 before we need to use
All right.
time. So if everybody can just keep their multifaceted questions to as few facets as
Yeah, that's right. All right, sir, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Turek. It's
Yeah.
a pleasure to get to see you
Thank you, sir.
do your thing in person. I've been following you for a long time. I've read your book. It's an amazing book. I always tell people if you read this and don't believe in Christianity, I question your intelligence. But I know it's about 20 years old at this point. I did have a question because I listen to your podcast as well frequently. It seems as though with the cosmological argument, you have recently shortened that from S.U.R.G.E to S.U.R.E, and it seems like you might have taken out the great galaxy seed.
No,
portion.
I'm not taking it out.
Okay.
We're not taking out the great galaxy seeds. It's just, you don't need it to make the case.
Okay.
So if you have limited time, you do second law, universe expanding, radiation afterglow, Einstein. Okay. G, great galaxy seeds, it's a little bit difficult, and it's more of a design argument than a cosmological argument, but it fits well with the cosmological argument too. So it could be in the design argument because it's more of a fine-tuning issue than it is a creation issue.
Okay, perfect.
All right?
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Yes, ma'am. What's your name? I got you. Yeah. Watch out, Clint. Sorry. Don't touch his microphones.
Thank you.
Hey, what's your name?
My name is Arden. Nice to meet you, Dr. Turek.
Good to meet you. Thank you.
I have a question. Let me pull it up real quick. Give me a second. So you said in the section on does God exist that an eternal past for the universe is impossible because how would we have ever attained the present day if the past is eternal?
Right.
But if mathematicians have no problem dealing with specific points in infinite space all the time, how can this be so? And also, if the past can't be eternal, wouldn't that also be a problem for Christians who believe in an eternal God?
Yeah, excellent question. So let's do the first one.
It is like 2 parts, sorry.
The first one you mentioned has to do with mathematical. Well, mathematical sets in the abstract, you can say I have an infinite set, but you couldn't, like, say, have an infinite number of marbles, or an infinite number of seconds, or an infinite number of finite things. You can have that mathematically in the abstract, but not in the concrete. So there's a difference between the abstract and the concrete. Now, when we say God is eternal, what we mean is God is outside of time, not that God is living forever over a series of moments passing from one to the other. When we say God is eternal, he's outside of time, so when he creates the space-time continuum, he creates time with space and matter, space-time and matter, so to speak. And that's one aspect of Einstein's theory of general relativity, is that space-time and matter are correlative. They came into existence together. So space-time and matter are a unit, if you will. And before, ontologically before, what we mean by that is not chronologically, because there was no time, but ontologically prior, meaning prior to there being a creation, then there was no time. God was in eternity.
Okay.
All right?
Follow-up question for that.
Yeah.
Do you believe in an eternal future in the concrete?
Yes, you can live, you can have eternal life and never die, but you had a beginning. Okay? God is outside the whole set. He didn't have a beginning, he won't have an end. We have a beginning and won't have an end.
We as entities have a beginning. I'm sorry, I don't want to take up your time.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. All right.
We as entities have a beginning.
Right.
So, like, I guess I'm just trying to make a comparison here between an atheist who claims the eternality of matter and the physical laws of the universe, and a Christian who claims the eternality or the outsideness of time of God.
Well, the atheist, his position or her position's on the table. The problem is it doesn't fit with the evidence for two reasons. Space-time and matter had a beginning we can see that from philosophy and also from the scientific evidence, the Big Bang cosmology. And secondly, from a second law perspective, the second law of thermodynamics shows that matter can't be eternal. Matter and energy can't be eternal. Because in a closed system, there's only a certain amount of usable energy. And as time goes on, the amount of usable energy decreases until you get complete unusable energy, which means that this universe must have had a beginning, because if it didn't have a beginning, we'd be out of energy right now.
Okay, so it's due to the scientific evidence.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That
All
makes
right.
sense.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yes, Seth, go ahead, sir.
Hello. Come close to it, please.
Okay. Just real quick, just want to thank you for being here on behalf of me and everyone else here at RF.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's always great to have you. Going back to the cosmological argument, I was just going to ask, you mentioned, the whole thing of the matter, energy, space, time all came into existence at some finite point in the past. Therefore, it would have needed a creator that is, spaceless, all that, but timeless. But that seems to imply that a cause would be occurring before time came into existence. So can we even have a coherent notion of causality in a timeless environment?
Yes.
How do we even make sense of such a thing?
Yes, because as William Lane Craig would say, the man who's on your shirt, he would say that causality was simultaneous with the creation event. Okay, so, and it's hard to speak this way because we're using temporal language to describe a period where there was no temporality, there was no time, but before, meaning ontologically before again, it wasn't until God created the universe at that creation point was the cause. God created the universe in a simultaneous way. The same way, and it's an analogy, but that light right there is being held up simultaneously on that rack, right? It's causing that light to stay up. And that rack is staying up because it's attached to the building. And the building is staying up because it's attached to the earth. And the earth is staying up because there's a law out there that's keeping us, laws out there, forces that keep us doing what we're doing. And laws come from lawgivers. So an argument we didn't have time to talk about right now is that the universe is directed, the laws that govern the universe are directed, and they don't have a mind of their own, so there must be an external mind that put those laws and forces in place and keeps them going. This is what Aristotle called the unmoved mover. Thomas Aquinas came along in the 1200s and said, this is going to be my fifth way to argue for God, that all of nature is consistently going in a direction. If it's going in a direction, there must be some mind directing it. This isn't a cause in the past, it's a cause every single second the universe exists. It's a simultaneous cause. It's not a historical cause, it's a vertical cause. Every single second the universe exists, there are laws that are holding it together. And someone just a few minutes ago quoted when Paul said, in him we live and move and have our being. And by the way, the writer of Hebrews says, God sustains all things by his powerful word. So you can have a simultaneous cause, just like that's a simultaneous cause right now.
but could time have just had some nexus, and it just doesn't make any sense to say it came from anything?
Well, you could
because it
say
was just
anything.
there?
Could it have? It could it have, but do we have any evidence for that?
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
I think it runs into like the limit of what human knowledge can really get to, and so I just feel like it's hard to like argue sometimes because like it kind of goes into a spiral of the things that are really hard to even comprehend.
Okay, but
So that's
the
why I
law of
asked that
causality says everything that comes to be as a cause inside the universe, right? Certainly that's the case.
Sure.
Okay. Why would we expect that law to be different for the universe itself? I mean, what's the
there's no
odds-on
explicit
favorite? Why don't we
reason
look at it that way? What's the odds-on favorite? What's the odds-on favorite? That the universe had a cause or it didn't? That it did, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. There you go.
All right,
All
thank
right,
you.
thanks. All right. Yes, sir, 5 minutes. Go ahead. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hey, this is Stephen Thompson. Nice to
Hey,
meet you,
Stephen.
Dr. Frank.
You too, man. How you doing?
My question would be, when you read the New Testament and God, end quote, and the Lord is mentioned without context or mention of a person, or mention of a Godhead, is it always to safely assume that the writer is referring to the triune being of God, and the text applies to all three persons?
That's Ryan Cruz. Ryan, answer that. Go ahead. Go up there to the microphone and answer it. Because he's a New Testament scholar.
When you read the New Testament, thank you. When you read the New Testament and God and the Lord is mentioned without context or mention of a person or persons of the Godhead, is it always safe to assume the writer is referring to the triune being of God and the text applies to all three persons?
Go up to the mic, Ryan. Give him your best shot.
Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Thanks, Frank. This is Tashi. So I would say no. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and we've only got a couple of minutes, so I won't get into all of them. But maybe the most obvious reason is within the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are different persons, right? So they are all God. This isn't tritheism. But some of the things that apply to the Son do not necessarily apply to the Father, which do not necessarily apply to the Spirit. And they do have distinct personalities and functions. So if you were to say that every time something is ascribed to Jesus, for example, with his humanity, with him being called, the Davidic king who reigns on David's throne, you can't apply that to the Spirit per se, because the Spirit is not humanly incarnate from the line of David, so like that wouldn't make sense, right? Maybe that's a silly example. But there are some things, like the attributes of God certainly apply to all persons of the Godhead. But some of the functions of individual members of the Godhead do not necessarily apply to each one, because if they did, why would there even be a Trinity? Like, what would be even the purpose of using that language? So I guess if there's a specific example you have in mind, we could look at it. But I would say, as a rule, no. You should try to distinguish who's being discussed. There's actually other Dallas Seminary grads here, so gentlemen, if you want to hop in, feel free. But that's what I would say. So, is that helpful, Frank?
That's good. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Dr. Frank.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it. I just bring help with me. Yeah. All right, maybe we got time for one more. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Sweet. I actually got 3 questions. You just want me to
just go to one, because I think
okay.
we got 2 minutes.
Just want to know what your eschatology view on Revelation. Are you...
Look, I'm not on the planning committee. I'm on the welcoming committee. All right. So I know we win in the end. I know that Jesus is coming back, but I think that his second coming is veiled just like his first coming was. In fact, Paul says in, I want to say it's 1 Corinthians 2, when he says that that God kept it a mystery so the principalities and powers, if they had known, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. And so I think God purposefully, although when you look back at the Old Testament, you can see all the Old Testament prophecies after Jesus comes. When Jesus comes, he sort of like gives us the box top of a puzzle of prophecy from the Old Testament. And you go, oh, now I see how all this fits together. I see how Isaiah 53 and Daniel 9 and Micah 5:2 and all these verses, how they all fit together now to Jesus. But before Jesus came, we couldn't really put it together. I think the same is going to be true when Jesus comes again. No one knows the times, nor the seasons, the day, nor the hour. He's going to come like a thief in the night. If God wanted to tell us when he was coming back, he could. But if he did tell us, suppose he said he's coming in 2034. How would that change our behavior now? I got time. I can live it up. 2033 and a half, I'll start getting my affairs in order. No. He could come at any minute. And that's the way God wants us to think about it. He could come at any minute. All right?
Thank you.
All right. Folks, thanks for being here. And our executive director was here, but she had to go out. Lynn Handley was here. And Clint Bolin is great. He films all this for us and live streams it. I want you to know that universities in Louisiana the week after that. Please pray for us as we go to these places, and if you feel led to support what we do, as you there. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. You got to say something else, man? Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.